Good evening. Tonight's broadcast is, as you might suspect, a work of fiction. There are, to our knowledge, no legions of the dead rising from their graves, no silent armies marching beneath the moon, and no mournful echoes carried across our cities by the restless departed. The voices you are about to hear have been generated by artificial intelligence. This production makes use of the names of real historical figures, yet it in no way reflects their words, deeds, or actions. Any other resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, remains purely coincidental. And now, with the airwaves cleared and your set tuned in, let us begin.
Good evening, America. This is Frank McLeod welcoming you to CBS Radio News, broadcasting from our studios high atop the Chrysler Building here in New York City. It's 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on this Sunday evening, and we'll be bringing you the latest developments from across the nation and around the world at the top of each hour. Tonight's headlines include updates on reconstruction efforts in the European theater, President Truman's latest Veterans Housing Initiative, and labor negotiations in Detroit's automotive plants. We'll also have weather forecasts for the upcoming work week, sports scores from around the National League, and market reports from Wall Street. But first, we're pleased to present 15 minutes of America's finest musical entertainment, featuring the smooth sounds of the Scott Miller Orchestra. So pour yourself a cup of coffee, settle back in your favorite chair, and let CBS Radio bring you the very best in evening entertainment. We'll return at the top of the hour with all the news that affects you and your family. This is Frank McLeod for CBS Radio. Stay tuned, America. Good evening, this is Frank McLeod with the evening news from CBS Radio New York. Tonight we begin with reports from our occupation forces in Germany, where American servicemen continue the challenging work of reconstruction and peacekeeping. Military censors have noted an increase in correspondence requiring review, though officials stress this is routine procedure for overseas deployment. Some of our returning veterans have shared unusual experiences during their service in the former Reich, leading to increased requests for counseling services at veterans' hospitals nationwide. Army medical officers report these accounts are consistent with combat fatigue, though they acknowledge the particular challenges of serving in a defeated enemy nation. We now go live to our correspondent Fred Dobbs at the War Department.
Thank you, Frank. I'm reporting tonight from the War Department, where officials have been reviewing correspondence from the European theater. While most letters from our servicemen overseas contain routine news from home, some have raised questions among military postal inspectors. Several letters mention what soldiers describe as restless nights in German cities, with unexplained disturbances in areas that have been cleared of enemy forces. Private James Watson writes to his mother in Cleveland, "The locals here tell some strange stories about the bombing. Say some folks got so shook up they never quite settled down again." Another letter from Corporal Sean Brody in Bavaria mentions, "Burial detail is hard work, but at least it's quiet duty, though Sergeant Morrison swears he saw movement in the old cemetery last week. Doc says it's just nerves getting to all of us." Army officials emphasize these reports reflect the normal psychological pressures of occupation duty and that counseling services are available for all returning personnel. Back to you, Frank.
Thank you, Fred. Joining us now is Sergeant Philip Marlowe, recently returned from 15 months of occupation duty in Germany.
Well, Frank, I appreciate the chance to set the record straight. There's been some talk among the boys about unusual things happening over there, but I think folks back home need to understand the conditions we're working under. Germany's in rough shape, no question about it. Bombed out buildings, displaced people wandering around, and winter was particularly hard this year. When you're working burial details in that kind of environment, your mind can play tricks on you. Now, I did see some things that gave me pause. Graves that looked disturbed, tracks in the snow that didn't make much sense. But hungry animals will do desperate things, Frank, and desperate people will too. Could have been scavengers, could have been displaced persons looking for anything useful. I remember one incident outside Hamburg, must have been early February. We were called to help with cleanup after a bombing raid from 43 that had collapsed part of an old cemetery. Local German workers refused to go near the place, kept crossing themselves and muttering in their language. Our chaplain said they were just superstitious. You know how these old European towns can be. Took us 3 days to clear the debris and restore some dignity to the site. But each morning we'd come back and find our work partially undone. Stones moved around, dirt scattered about. The lieutenant blamed it on local kids playing pranks, but I never saw any children in that part of town. Place had been pretty well cleared out during the war. The important thing is that our boys are doing good work over there, helping to rebuild and keep the peace. If some of them need a little extra support when they get home, well, that's what we're here for.
Thank you, Sergeant Marlowe, for that perspective and for your distinguished service. The Veterans Administration reminds us that readjustment counseling is available at hospitals nationwide and that unusual experiences during overseas service are not uncommon among our returning heroes. Dr. Benjamin McKenna at Walter Reed Hospital notes that the stress of occupation duty, particularly in areas that saw heavy combat, can create what he terms heightened sensitivity to environmental disturbances. He assures families that with proper care and understanding, these reactions typically resolve within a few months of return to civilian life. The doctor also mentioned that reports of disturbed burial sites have been documented in other conflict zones throughout history, often attributed to natural settling, animal activity, or in some cases deliberate disturbance by local populations. He emphasized that there are always rational explanations for such phenomena. In related news, the War Department announced today that rotation schedules for European occupation forces will be accelerated, with most personnel expected to return stateside by year's end. General Eisenhower's office stated that this decision reflects the successful stabilization of occupied territories rather than any particular concerns about conditions on the ground. We'll continue to follow developments from the European theater and remind our listeners that letters to servicemen overseas should maintain positive, encouraging content to support morale during these final months of occupation duty. This has been Frank McLeod for CBS Radio. We'll be right back after this brief message from Lucky Strike Cigarettes with tonight's weather forecast and the latest from the baseball pennant race. Then stay tuned for Tales Beyond Tomorrow, premiering with the first chapter of a new 5-part serial, Red Planet Rising, written and directed by Orson Welles. Good evening, America.
Good evening, folks. This is Ben Cooper speaking for Ramirez Family Market in rural Pennsylvania. When you're looking for fresh provisions to stock your farmhouse, remember that Ramirez has everything you need to survive any crisis. Our market stays open late. We understand that sometimes you need supplies when the night gets dark and dangerous. Ramirez Family Market will keep you fed when the world goes crazy. Located on Cemetery Road, just past the old Evans farmhouse.
Good evening, friends. This is your host welcoming you to another thrilling installment of Tales Beyond Tomorrow. Brought to you by Purity Supreme Coffee, the coffee that keeps America awake and alert. Tonight, we begin a special 5-part serial, The Red Planet Rising. It was on a crisp autumn evening in the small town of Grover's Mill, when Professor Henry Caldwell first noticed something peculiar through his telescope. He'd been studying Mars for 30 years, charting its canals and mysterious dark regions. But nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed that October night. A brilliant flash emanated from the Martian surface. Not the typical glint of ice caps catching sunlight, but something different, something deliberate. The flash repeated, once, twice, 3 times, each pulse separated by exactly 47 seconds. Professor Caldwell's hands trembled as he checked his calculations. The flashes were not natural phenomena. They were signals. He immediately telephoned his colleague at the Mount Wilson Observatory, Dr. Thomas Doyle. He confirmed his observations. All across the world, astronomers were seeing the same thing. Within hours, the flashes stopped, replaced by something far more troubling. A luminous object had detached itself from Mars and was moving through space at an impossible speed. The papers tried to downplay it. Meteor shower expected, they said. Unusual solar activity, claimed the government scientists. But Professor Caldwell knew better. He'd calculated the trajectory. Whatever had left Mars was heading directly toward Earth, and it would arrive in less than 48 hours. That first night, as the professor sat alone in his study, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He rushed to his window and saw his neighbors standing in their yards,
all looking up at the eastern sky where a new star had appeared, a new star that was growing brighter by the minute. And that's when the first one landed. The impact shook the ground for miles around. Farmer Jessup's North Field, folks would later say. By the time the first curious townsfolk arrived with their lanterns and deer rifles, the cylinder had already started to unscrew itself from within. The metal groaned and shrieked as massive threads worked against each other. And then the top fell away with a thunderous crash. What emerged from that cylinder? Well, that's where our tale truly begins. But I'm afraid we're out of time for this evening. Tune in tomorrow night, same time, same station, to hear part 2 of The Red Planet Rising. Will the creatures that emerged be friend or foe? What do they want with our small planet? Until then, remember, friends, keep your eyes on the skies. This has been Tales Beyond Tomorrow, brought to you by Purity Supreme Coffee. Good night.
Before we continue with tonight's programming, we have one more item from our European correspondents. This letter arrived at our studios today, forwarded by the family of Private David Graham of the 101st Airborne, currently on leave in Kansas. Private Graham writes, "Dear Sally, hope this finds you well, and that Ma's garden is coming along nice this spring. Things are quiet here in Bavaria, which is a blessing after all we've been through. The work keeps us busy, mostly cleanup and helping the locals get back on their feet. Can't complain about the duty, though some of the German towns are pretty grim still. A lot of folks didn't make it through the winter, and the burial details have been steady work. Funny thing happened yesterday, though. We were working in an old churchyard that got hit pretty bad during the fighting. Had to rebury some graves that got disturbed by the bombing. Corporal Hayes swore he saw one of the headstones rocking back and forth, but when we went to check, everything looked normal. Probably just the ground settling, or maybe one of those wild dogs we've been seeing around town. Anyway, don't want you worrying about your little brother. Should be home by Christmas if all goes according to plan. Give my love to Ma, and tell her I'm keeping out of trouble. Your brother, David." Private Graham's unit is scheduled to return to the United States in November. We now return to our regular evening programming. Ladies, are you tired of looking pale and lifeless? Try Dawn Beauty products. Our revolutionary rouge will bring color back to your cheeks, and our powder compact is small enough to fit in any purse. Perfect for touch-ups during shopping trips to the department store. Dawn Beauty products, because a lady should always look alive. Available at Penny's Fine Cosmetics and select department stores nationwide. Good evening, this is Frank McLeod with the CBS Radio Evening News from New York. Our top story tonight concerns the arrival of German prisoners of war and civilian personnel at East Coast ports, part of the continuing repatriation and denazification efforts in occupied Europe. 3 transport vessels arrived at Norfolk Naval Base yesterday carrying approximately 800 German prisoners and civilian detainees, including several dozen scientists and technical personnel who will be interviewed by Allied intelligence officers. The ships completed their Atlantic crossing after a 14-day voyage from Bremerhaven, though the journey was reportedly complicated by rough weather and what Navy officials describe as minor medical issues among the passengers. Port Authority officials stressed that all standard quarantine and security procedures are being followed and that local residents should experience no disruption to normal harbor activities. The prisoners will be processed at nearby military facilities before transfer to appropriate detention centers throughout the United States. We now go live to our correspondent, Fred Dobbs, at Norfolk Waterfront.
Thank you, Frank. I'm reporting tonight from the Norfolk waterfront, where longshoremen and naval personnel have been working since dawn to process the arrival of these German detainees. While officials describe the operation as routine, several dock workers have shared concerning accounts of the voyage's final days. Thomas Quinn, a stevedore with 20 years' experience at Norfolk, was among the first aboard the transport vessel Meridian Star. He told me, "Never seen anything quite like it in all my years on the docks. Medical officer came off that ship looking like he hadn't slept in a week. Said they'd had some kind of pneumonia outbreak, but the way those German prisoners were acting when they brought them down the gangway, well, it didn't look like any lung sickness I ever saw." Quinn described an incident during the unloading process where one of the German detainees, reportedly suffering from fever, became violent and bit a Navy corpsman on the arm. The prisoner was immediately sedated and removed to the base medical facility, while the injured sailor was treated for what officials termed a minor laceration. Harbor Master William Hayes confirmed that additional medical personnel were called to assist with the processing, but emphasized that such incidents are not unusual when dealing with prisoners who have endured poor conditions during transport. He noted that the Atlantic crossing had been particularly rough, with several days of storm weather that left many passengers seasick and disoriented. Back to you, Frank.
Thank you, Fred. We're joined now by Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Brennan from the War Department's Prisoner Processing Division, who can provide additional context on these arrival procedures.
Thank you, Frank. I want to assure the American people that what we witnessed in Norfolk yesterday was entirely within the normal parameters of prisoner repatriation operations. These individuals have been confined aboard ship for 2 weeks, often in cramped conditions, and many are suffering from malnutrition and various illnesses contracted during their imprisonment in Germany. The medical officer aboard the Meridian Star reported several cases of what appears to be pneumonia, along with general weakness and disorientation common among prisoners who have endured extended captivity. The violent incident mentioned by dock workers involved a prisoner suffering from high fever, a symptom that can cause delirium and aggressive behavior in severely ill individuals. Our medical staff at Norfolk are experienced in treating such conditions, and I'm pleased to report that the affected prisoners are receiving appropriate care. The Navy corpsman who was injured has been treated with standard first aid and preventive antibiotics and is expected to return to duty within days. I should emphasize that these scientific and technical personnel are being brought to the United States for intelligence purposes as part of our ongoing efforts to understand the full scope of German wartime research activities. Every precaution is being taken to ensure both security and humanitarian treatment of all detainees during this process.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Brennan. Navy medical officers at Norfolk have stated that isolation protocols are in place for any prisoners showing signs of illness, and that local health authorities have been notified as a standard precautionary measure. The arrival of German scientific personnel marks a significant phase in Allied intelligence efforts to catalog and understand advanced research conducted by the Nazi regime. Intelligence officials note that many of these individuals possess knowledge that could prove valuable in understanding the full extent of wartime German scientific activities. Processing of the detainees is expected to continue through the remainder of the week, with most prisoners scheduled for transfer to permanent facilities by the weekend. Navy officials remind local residents that the harbor area remains under military security and ask that civilians avoid the processing zones until normal port operations resume. In other news tonight, President Truman announced new housing construction programs for returning veterans, while Congress continues debate on the proposed Marshall Plan for European reconstruction. This has been Frank McLeod for CBS Radio. Stay tuned for Arthur Smith and his Evening Variety Hour, brought to you by Redfield Tea. Good night from New York.
We interrupt your regular programming for an important announcement from the War Department. Effective immediately, civilian personnel are advised to maintain appropriate distance from all prisoner processing facilities, military transport vehicles, and temporary detention areas. This directive applies to all East Coast naval bases, Army installations, and associated medical facilities currently handling foreign detainees. While the War Department emphasizes that these precautions are purely procedural, civilians should not attempt to approach, photograph, or interact with prisoners of war or civilian detainees under any circumstances. Military police have been instructed to enforce security perimeters around all processing areas. Local medical facilities are reminded that any military personnel presenting with unusual injuries or illness following contact with foreign detainees should be reported immediately to base medical officers. Standard isolation and treatment protocols remain in effect for all cases involving potential infectious disease. Dock workers, transportation personnel, and other civilian contractors working in proximity to these operations should report any health concerns to their supervisors without delay. Precautionary medical examinations are available at no cost through military medical facilities. The War Department wishes to emphasize that these measures represent standard security protocols and that the American public should not be alarmed by these routine precautionary steps. Processing operations are proceeding normally, and all detainees are receiving appropriate medical care and humane treatment in accordance with international law. This has been an official announcement from the United States War Department. We now return to your regularly scheduled programming.
Attention sports enthusiasts. Sean's Sporting Goods has everything you need for America's favorite pastime. Our premium baseball bats are handcrafted for maximum impact, and our Winchester rifles are perfect for weekend shooting competitions. Whether you're defending home plate or heading to the Winchester Club for a beer after the game, Sean's has you covered. Sean's Sporting Goods will help you knock it out of the park. Good evening. This is Frank McLeod with the CBS Radio Evening News from New York. Tonight we begin with a concerning development regarding some of our returning veterans, as military hospitals report an increase in what doctors are calling severe readjustment episodes among servicemen recently returned from European duty. The incident that has drawn particular attention occurred yesterday afternoon in downtown Chicago when Master Sergeant Rick Blaine, a decorated veteran of the Italian and German campaigns, suffered what witnesses described as a complete nervous breakdown during a Victory Bond rally at Daley Plaza. Sergeant Blaine, who holds both the Bronze Star and Purple Heart, had to be restrained by police after shouting warnings to the crowd about what he termed the enemy that will not die. The incident has prompted renewed discussion among military medical officers about the long-term psychological effects of extended combat duty, particularly among veterans who served in the final phases of the European War. Officials stress that such episodes, while disturbing to witness, are treatable conditions that affect a small percentage of returning servicemen. We now go live to our correspondent in the field.
Thank you, Frank. I'm reporting from Chicago, where yesterday's incident at Daley Plaza has left many residents shaken and concerned for our returning heroes. Master Sergeant Blaine had been scheduled to speak about his experiences liberating German prison camps, but instead delivered what witnesses described as an increasingly agitated warning about unfinished business in Europe. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, who was attending the rally with her children, described the scene. He started off normal enough, talking about how proud we should be of our boys, but then his voice changed, got all strained and desperate-like. He kept saying the Germans had found a way to keep fighting even after they were dead, that some kind of poison or disease was making the bodies get back up. Police Sergeant Vincent Parry, who helped restrain Blaine, noted that the veteran seemed genuinely terrified rather than merely confused. He kept looking over his shoulder, like something was chasing him, and he grabbed my arm so tight it left bruises. He was shouting about burning the bodies, said we had to tell people to burn them or they'd keep coming back. Dr. Julius O'Hara from the Veterans Administration Hospital here in Chicago examined Sergeant Blaine after the incident. He reports that the veteran is suffering from what appears to be severe combat neurosis complicated by what he terms persistent intrusive memories of battlefield trauma. The sergeant is currently under observation and receiving appropriate medical care. Back to you, Frank.
Thank you, Fred. We're joined now by Dr. Paul Beegler, chief psychiatrist at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center, who has been studying these types of combat-related psychological conditions.
Thank you, Frank. What we witnessed in Chicago yesterday represents a tragic but not uncommon manifestation of what we're learning to recognize as delayed combat stress reaction. Sergeant Blaine's military record shows he participated in some of the most intense fighting of the European campaign, including the liberation of several German concentration camps. The human mind, when exposed to the extreme horrors of modern warfare, sometimes creates protective mechanisms that can later manifest in disturbing ways. Veterans who have witnessed mass casualties, particularly in situations where proper burial was impossible, often develop what we call death fixation, an overwhelming preoccupation with the fate of enemy dead. I've treated several similar cases in recent months, Frank. Veterans who insist they saw enemy soldiers continue fighting after sustaining wounds that should have been immediately fatal. Others report nightmares about German dead rising from battlefield graves. These are not supernatural experiences, but rather the mind's attempt to process trauma by creating explanatory narratives, however impossible they might seem to rational observers. What concerns us medically is that some veterans are reporting similar experiences, which suggests these psychological patterns may be more widespread than initially believed. We've documented cases where veterans claim they had to inflict head wounds on already dead enemies to make them stay down permanently, as Sergeant Blaine described it yesterday. The important thing for families to understand is that these episodes are treatable through a combination of rest, counseling, and in some cases mild sedation. With proper care, most veterans experiencing these symptoms can expect significant improvement within several months.
Dr. Beegler, we thank you for that medical perspective. The Veterans Administration has announced that additional psychiatric services will be made available at military hospitals nationwide, with particular focus on veterans who served during the final months of the European campaign. Family members are encouraged to watch for signs of what doctors call combat exhaustion, including persistent nightmares, sudden outbursts of fear or anger, and unusual preoccupation with wartime experiences. Early treatment, official stress, greatly improves the likelihood of full recovery. Sergeant Blaine's family has requested privacy during his treatment, though his brother issued a statement describing him as a good soldier who gave everything for his country and deserves our support, not our judgment. The War Department has confirmed that all medical care will be provided at no cost to the veteran or his family. Tomorrow we'll have a special report on new job training programs designed specifically for returning veterans, as well as an update on reconstruction efforts in the Pacific Theater. This has been Frank McCloud for CBS Radio. Coming up after the news, the continuing saga of Tales Beyond Tomorrow, Part 2 of Orson Welles' thrilling new adventure, Red Planet Rising. Stay with us.
Good evening, friends, and welcome back to Tales Beyond Tomorrow. I'm your host. And before we continue with Part 2 of the Red Planet Rising, let me remind you that Purity Supreme Coffee is the choice of discerning Americans from coast to coast. Now let's return to Grover's Mill, where something terrible has just crawled forth from the cylinder. The crowd that had gathered around the impact crater numbered perhaps 40 souls. Farmers mostly, along with Sheriff McGrady and his deputy. They held their lanterns high as that top piece clattered to the scorched earth, steam hissing from the cylinder's interior. Young Billy Harrison would later tell the newspapers, before he stopped talking altogether, that the first thing he saw was something like a tentacle, gray and glistening in the lamplight, thick as a man's torso and covered in what looked like suckers. Then came another and another, pulling a bulbous body up from the depths of the machine. The creature that emerged stood nearly 15 feet tall when it reared up. Its body was roughly the size and shape of a bear, but there the similarity ended. The skin appeared wet, almost translucent, revealing dark masses moving beneath organs, perhaps though not like any earthly anatomy. The head, if you could call it such, was all mouth and eyes, great luminous eyes, large as dinner plates, that seemed to take in everything with a cold intelligence. And the mouth, God help us, the mouth was a writhing mass of thin tentacles surrounding a V-shaped beak. Sheriff McGrady raised his revolver. "Now hold on there," he called out, his voice steady despite the fear. "We don't want any trouble." The creature regarded him with those terrible eyes. Then it made a sound that started as a whisper and built to a shriek that shattered every window for half a mile. It wasn't a voice, not really. It was more like 1,000 voices screaming in unison, a sound that bypassed the ears and stabbed directly into the brain. That's when the killing began. The first heat ray lanced out from a device mounted on the creature's harness, if you could call it a harness. The beam was invisible save for where it touched, and where it touched, men and women simply burst into flame. Sheriff McGrady managed to fire 3 shots before he, too, was consumed. The bullets struck the creature's hide and bounced off as useless as pebbles against armor plate. Professor Caldwell, watching from a safe distance through his field glasses, saw it all. He saw the survivors scatter. He saw the creature lumber back toward its cylinder. And he saw something worse. 3 more cylinders falling through the night sky, their hulls glowing red with friction as they screamed toward Earth. By dawn, 4 cylinders had landed in a rough circle around Grover's Mill. By noon, the Army had arrived with tanks and artillery. General Hutchinson set up a perimeter and ordered his men to shell the cylinders without mercy. The shells landed true. Explosions rocked the countryside, sending geysers of earth skyward. But when the smoke cleared, the cylinders remained intact, not even scratched. And worse, much worse, the Martians had been busy during the bombardment. They'd constructed something in the night. A tripod, Professor Caldwell called it, though that name hardly did justice to the thing. It stood 100 feet tall, a 3-legged walking machine of black metal, topped with a hood that housed one of the creatures. The heat ray protruded like a terrible eye. General Hutchinson gave the order to retreat. But it was too late. The tripod took its first steps, each footfall shaking the earth like thunder, and began its march toward the nearest town. By nightfall, Grover's Mill was nothing but ash. By the following morning, the Martians had built 5 more tripods. And by the time Professor Caldwell reached the radio station in the city to warn others, 17 more cylinders had been spotted falling across the nation. The invasion had begun in earnest. Join us tomorrow evening for Part 3 of The Red Planet Rising. Can humanity mount a defense against these terrible machines? Is there any weakness in the Martian armor? Until then, keep your loved ones close and your emergency supplies ready. This is Tales Beyond Tomorrow, brought to you by Purity Supreme Coffee, the coffee that never sleeps. Good night, friends.
We interrupt your regularly scheduled programming to bring you this special Sunday evening service from the First Baptist Church of Atlanta with Reverend Matthew Jacobs.
Dearly beloved, we gather in these troubled times to seek comfort in the Lord's eternal wisdom. Our nation has emerged victorious from the greatest conflict in human history, yet we find that victory brings its own burdens, its own challenges to the faithful heart. I speak tonight particularly to those families welcoming home our brave soldiers, our sons and brothers who have witnessed the depths of human evil and emerged forever changed. Scripture tells us in the book of Ecclesiastes, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted." But what of those times when the natural order seems disturbed, when our boys return home speaking of things that challenge our understanding of life and death, when the very earth seems restless and the peace of the grave appears uncertain? I do not speak of superstition, friends, but of the spiritual warfare that rages around us always. Our enemy, the devil himself, seeks to plant seeds of doubt and fear in the minds of our returning heroes. He whispers lies about the permanence of death, about the power of evil to persist beyond the grave. But let us remember the words of our Savior in the Gospel of John, "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live." It is Christ alone who holds dominion over death, Christ alone who determines when the faithful shall rise. To our veterans struggling with dark memories, to families frightened by tales that seem to defy God's natural law, I offer this comfort. What is buried in righteousness shall rest in peace. What is laid to rest with prayer and proper Christian burial cannot be disturbed by earthly powers. The Lord watches over both the living and the dead who trust in his name. Yet we must also remain vigilant, for Scripture warns us that in the last days there shall be signs and wonders that test the faith of even the elect. We must support our troubled veterans with prayer and Christian love while keeping our eyes fixed firmly on the truth of God's Word. Let us pray together now for our returning soldiers, that their minds may find peace and their souls find rest in the Lord's eternal care. Amen.
This has been Reverend Matthew Jacobs from the First Baptist Church of Atlanta. We now return to your regular programming. Say there, friend, are you feeling run down, tired, lacking that old fighting spirit since the boys came home? Well, have we got news for you? Introducing Selena's remarkable 28-day Vitality Tonic. Yes, sir, just 28 days to transform yourself from weary warrior to vigorous victor. This amazing patent medicine contains iron, natural stimulants, and secret military-grade compounds that'll awaken those primal survival instincts you thought you'd lost in the trenches. Why, Mrs. Henderson from Manchester writes, "My husband went from shell-shocked to sensational in less than a month. Now he's got bloodshot eyes full of determination and boundless energy. He chases after every opportunity with unstoppable vigor." Now, folks, we must warn you. Side effects may include heightened aggression, rapid heartbeat, and an irresistible urge to pursue physical activity. Not recommended near crowded dance halls or picture shows. Selena's 28-day Vitality Tonic, because sometimes you need to get infected with the spirit of victory. Available at fine apothecaries everywhere. That's Selena's, Selenas, 28-day Vitality Tonic. Business owners, protect your valuable research and development with Alice's Umbrella Corporation Security. Our trained guards provide round-the-clock protection for laboratories, pharmaceutical facilities, and underground research installations. We specialize in containing dangerous situations before they spread. Alice's Umbrella Corporation Security, we keep your secrets safe and your facilities secure. Good evening, this is Frank McLeod with the CBS Radio Evening News from New York. We begin tonight with breaking news from rural Pennsylvania, where a military freight train derailed early this morning approximately 15 miles outside the town of Millfield. The accident, which occurred at approximately 3:30 a.m. Eastern Time, involved 7 cars carrying what Army officials describe as classified medical supplies and research materials. Initial reports from Pennsylvania State Police indicate that no military personnel were seriously injured in the derailment, though several cars were completely overturned and their contents scattered across a wide area. The cause of the accident remains under investigation, with railroad officials citing possible track defects caused by recent heavy rains. What makes this story particularly noteworthy is the unusual response from military authorities, who arrived at the scene within hours and immediately established a security perimeter around the crash site. Local residents have been asked to avoid the area while cleanup operations continue, with officials citing potential hazards from damaged medical equipment and chemical supplies. We now go live to our correspondent in the field, Fred Dobbs, reporting from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Frank. I'm speaking to you from Millfield, Pennsylvania, where the normally quiet farming community has been buzzing with activity since this morning's train derailment. While military officials have restricted access to the actual crash site, several local residents witnessed the immediate aftermath before security cordons were established. Henry Morrison, a dairy farmer whose property borders the railroad right-of-way, was among the first civilians to reach the scene. He told me, "I heard the crash clear as day, sounded like thunder rolling across the valley. By the time I got my boots on and walked over there, one of the cars had split right open like a dropped egg." Morrison described seeing large wooden crates scattered around the overturned freight car, several of which had been damaged in the crash. Strangest thing, though, he said, some of those crates had metal restraints on them, heavy chains and locks like you'd use for dangerous animals, and there was this smell, sweet and sick at the same time, like meat that's gone bad in the summer heat. Most disturbing was Morrison's account of what he glimpsed inside one of the broken crates before military personnel arrived. At first, I thought it was just medical equipment, tubes and wires running into what looked like a body on some kind of table. But then I got closer and saw it was a person, or what was left of one. German uniform, I think, but the face, Morrison paused, visibly shaken. The face was gray as old meat, and the eyes were open, staring at nothing. But the worst part was when it turned its head and looked right at me. Morrison continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I swear on my mother's grave, that thing was dead, had to be dead. No living person looks like that. But it moved its head slow-like, and its mouth started working, opening and closing like it was trying to bite the air. Made this low sound, almost like moaning. I backed away real quick, and that's when I heard others making the same noise from some of the other crates." By 6 a.m., Army trucks had surrounded the crash site, and Morrison, along with 2 other witnesses, were escorted away by military police. Before leaving, Morrison says he heard what sounded like hammering and the hiss of welding equipment as soldiers worked to reseal the damaged containers. They were in a real hurry, he noted, and every single one of them soldiers had their sidearms drawn while they worked. All witnesses were required to sign official documents and were warned that discussing the incident could compromise national security. Back to you, Frank.
Thank you, Fred. We're joined now by Dr. Jefferson Smith from the Army Medical Research Command, who can provide some context on the type of materials that might require such security measures.
Thank you, Frank. While I cannot discuss the specific contents of this particular shipment due to security classifications, I can explain that the Army Medical Research Command regularly transports various types of scientific materials and specimens for research purposes. Following the conclusion of hostilities in Europe, American forces have recovered extensive medical and scientific equipment from German research facilities. Much of this material requires careful analysis to determine its purpose and potential applications. Some items, particularly those involving experimental medical procedures, must be transported under strict containment protocols. The restraints and containment systems described by witnesses are standard equipment for transporting delicate scientific specimens or potentially hazardous materials. German research facilities often employed unusual preservation techniques for medical samples, some of which may appear disturbing to civilian observers unfamiliar with laboratory procedures. What the farmer described as a person was most certainly preserved cadaver material used for medical research and training purposes. German medical facilities were known to employ advanced preservation techniques that could maintain tissue samples in remarkably lifelike condition for extended periods. The apparent movement he witnessed was likely the result of mechanical ventilation systems designed to prevent decomposition, combined with possible muscle contractions caused by electrical systems still functioning within the preservation apparatus. I want to assure the public that all recovered materials are being handled by trained personnel following established safety protocols. The security measures at the crash site reflect the classified nature of ongoing research rather than any immediate danger to local residents. The investigation into this derailment will be thorough, and we expect to have the material secured and transported to appropriate facilities within the next few days.
Dr. Smith, we appreciate that clarification. Pennsylvania State Police have confirmed that the crash site remains off limits to civilian traffic, with detours established on local roads until cleanup operations are complete. Railroad officials from the Pennsylvania Railroad Company have launched their own investigation into the cause of the derailment, working in cooperation with military authorities. Preliminary reports suggest that track washout from recent storms may have contributed to the accident, though a full engineering analysis will be required before train service can resume on that section of track. Local residents have been asked to report any unusual debris or materials found on their property to military authorities immediately. Officials stress that while the risk to public health is considered minimal, some research materials may require special handling procedures. The town of Millfield has experienced its share of wartime disruptions, serving as a temporary housing location for German prisoners of war earlier this year. Mayor Charles Lindbergh noted that residents are accustomed to cooperating with military operations and expects full community support during the cleanup process. We'll continue to follow this developing story as more information becomes available. In other news tonight, President Truman announced new agricultural support programs for American farmers, while steel workers in Pittsburgh have reached a tentative agreement to end their 3-week strike. This has been Frank McLeod for CBS Radio. Good evening from all of us here in New York.
This is Nova Hayes with an important health advisory from the American Red Cross. We are issuing this bulletin in cooperation with the United States Public Health Service regarding unusual medical conditions that may be affecting some members of our communities.
In recent weeks, Red Cross chapters in Pennsylvania, New York, and several other eastern states have received reports of individuals experiencing sudden onset of high fever, accompanied by aggressive behavior and apparent disorientation. While these cases remain isolated, medical authorities are asking for increased vigilance from healthcare providers and family members.
Symptoms to watch for include sudden fever exceeding 103 degrees Fahrenheit, unusual agitation or violent behavior in normally peaceful individuals, difficulty speaking or responding to verbal commands, and what medical personnel describe as unusual oral fixation, an apparent compulsion to bite objects or, in some cases, other persons.
If you encounter an individual displaying these symptoms, do not attempt to restrain or calm them through physical contact. Instead, maintain a safe distance and contact local medical authorities immediately. Several healthcare workers have reported injuries while attempting to assist affected individuals, so we emphasize the importance of professional medical intervention.
Dr. Ellen Brody from the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta reports that preliminary investigations suggest these cases may be related to a rare form of neurological inflammation, possibly triggered by exposure to contaminated materials or unknown biological agents. Research is ongoing, but medical authorities stress that early identification and isolation of affected individuals is crucial. Red Cross emergency medical teams are being positioned in areas where cases have been reported, and we are working closely with military medical personnel to ensure proper treatment protocols are followed. Hospitals in affected areas have been provided with special isolation equipment
and guidelines for handling potentially dangerous patients.
Citizens are advised to report any unusual illness patterns in their communities to local health departments, particularly cases involving sudden personality changes or unexplained aggressive behavior. While the number of reported cases remains small, public cooperation is essential for preventing any possible spread of this condition. For more information about these health guidelines, contact your local Red Cross chapter or county health department. Remember, in cases of medical emergency involving aggressive or disoriented individuals, your safety and the safety of your family must come first. This has been Nova Hayes for the American Red Cross. We now return to your regularly scheduled programming.
Folks, when you're traveling cross-country and need a quick energy boost, reach for Tallahassee Snack Foods. Our delicious cream-filled sponge cakes and chocolate treats have been keeping Americans satisfied since the turn of the century. Perfect for long road trips or when you need to keep your energy up during stressful situations. Tallahassee Snack Foods, the taste worth fighting for. Good evening. This is Frank McLeod with the CBS Radio Evening News from New York. Our lead story tonight comes from rural Iowa, where health officials are investigating what they describe as an outbreak of severe influenza in communities surrounding the Algona prisoner of war camp. The facility, which has housed German prisoners since 1943, has reported an unusual number of medical emergencies over the past 10 days. Local physicians in Kossuth County have treated 17 cases of what appears to be an aggressive strain of influenza, characterized by extremely high fever and violent delirium. What makes this outbreak particularly concerning is that several patients have exhibited behavior that Dr. William Hayes, the county health officer, describes as unprecedented in my 30 years of medical practice. Camp officials stress that the situation remains under control, though they have implemented enhanced quarantine procedures for both prisoners and civilian staff. The Iowa State Health Department has dispatched additional medical personnel to assist with treatment and containment efforts, while emphasizing that there is no cause for widespread alarm. We now go live to our correspondent in the field, Fred Dobbs, reporting from Iowa.
Thank you, Frank. I'm reporting from the town of Algona, Iowa, population 3,200, where the normally quiet farming community has been shaken by a series of disturbing incidents over the past week and a half. The trouble appears to have begun when several civilian workers from the nearby POW camp fell ill with what local doctors initially diagnosed as seasonal influenza. Martha Collins, a nurse at Algona Community Hospital, described the first cases. They came in burning up with fever, temperatures we could barely measure. But it wasn't just the fever that worried us. These folks were acting like wild animals. Had to strap one man down because he kept trying to bite the orderlies. Never seen anything like it in all my years nursing. The situation became more alarming when some of the afflicted individuals, after apparent death from the fever, were discovered to be still moving. Local undertaker Benjamin McKenna reported an unprecedented incident at his funeral home. I've been preparing bodies for burial for 25 years. McKenna told me, and I can tell you with certainty that dead is dead. But 3 times this week, I've had to call the sheriff because bodies I'd already prepared were somehow getting off the tables and wandering around my facility. Perhaps most disturbing are reports from local farms where several families describe encounters with relatives who had succumbed to the illness but were later seen walking in fields and barns. Thomas Quinn, a dairy farmer outside Algona, reported seeing his brother-in-law wandering near his cattle 3 days after the man's funeral. Jake was moving real slow and jerky-like, Quinn said, and when I called out to him, he just turned and looked at me with eyes that weren't right anymore, had that same hungry look I'd seen in Mad Dogs. Back to you, Frank.
Thank you, Fred. We're joined now by Dr. Hugh Martin from the Iowa State Health Department, who is coordinating the response to this unusual outbreak.
Thank you, Frank. I want to begin by assuring the public that what we're dealing with in Kossuth County is a severe but manageable outbreak of influenza, complicated by what appears to be mass hysteria brought on by wartime stress and isolation. The high fever associated with this particular strain can cause extreme delirium and aggressive behavior, which explains the violent episodes described by medical personnel. As for the reports of individuals appearing to move after death, I must emphasize that these are cases of premature diagnosis of death combined with the psychological stress experienced by family members and community observers. What people are interpreting as supernatural activity is actually a combination of several medical factors. Cataleptic states brought on by extreme fever, in which individuals appear dead but retain minimal life functions, muscle spasms, and involuntary movement that can occur for hours after clinical death, and in some cases, misidentification of sick individuals by distraught family members. The Iowa State Health Department has implemented standard influenza containment protocols, including isolation of affected individuals and enhanced sanitation measures. We've also brought in additional medical staff trained in psychiatric emergency response, as community trauma can often manifest in reports of unusual or impossible events. I want to stress that the prisoner of war camp has been fully cooperative with our investigation, and there is no evidence that this outbreak originated from contact with German prisoners. Seasonal influenza outbreaks are common in agricultural communities during temperature transitions, and this appears to be a particularly virulent strain that has been exacerbated by local conditions.
Dr. Martin, we appreciate that medical perspective. The Iowa National Guard has been called in to assist with quarantine enforcement and to help maintain order in affected communities, though officials stress this is purely a precautionary measure. Local churches in the Algona area have organized prayer vigils and community support efforts for families affected by the outbreak. Reverend David Graham from the First Methodist Church noted that the community has faced many challenges during the war years and emphasized the importance of pulling together during this difficult time. The Red Cross has established temporary shelters for families whose homes have been placed under quarantine, and the Department of Agriculture has sent veterinarians to examine livestock in the affected area, though no animal infections have been reported thus far. Sheriff's departments in surrounding counties have been advised of the situation and are coordinating with state health officials to monitor any spread of the outbreak beyond Kosciuszko County. Roadblocks have been established on major routes leading out of the affected area, though officials emphasize these are health screening stations rather than travel restrictions. We'll continue to monitor this developing situation and bring you updates as they become available. In other news tonight, labor negotiations continue in Detroit's automotive plants, while President Truman announced new veterans' benefits legislation. This has been Frank McCloud for CBS Radio. Coming up next, the next thrilling installment of Tales Beyond Tomorrow, Part 3 of Orson Welles' epic science fiction serial, Red Planet Rising. Don't touch that dial.
Good evening, friends. Before we continue with Part 3 of the Red Planet Rising, I must remind you that despite these troubling fictional events, Purity Supreme Coffee remains available at your local grocer. In times of uncertainty, there's comfort in a good cup of coffee. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, the Martian tripods were on the move. Professor Caldwell had made it to Station WBX in the city, where he convinced the night manager to let him broadcast a warning. His message was simple and terrifying: evacuate. Get away from the impact sites. Head west toward the mountains. The military cannot stop them. But most people, you see, didn't believe him. How could they? Giant walking machines from Mars. It sounded like something from a pulp magazine. The government censors were quick to label it unverified panic-mongering, and by morning, Caldwell found himself detained by military police for spreading false information that undermined the war effort. Yes, there was a war effort by then. Not the war in Europe that had occupied everyone's thoughts, but a new war, one humanity was desperately unprepared to fight. The president addressed the nation at noon. He spoke of American resolve, of our fighting spirit, of how our boys would push back these invaders just as we'd pushed back every enemy before. He didn't mention that 3 major cities were already in flames. He didn't mention the refugees choking every road heading west. He didn't mention that every weapon we'd thrown at the Martians, bullets, shells, even aerial bombing, had proven utterly useless. Dr. Thomas Doyle, meanwhile, had not been idle. While Caldwell was detained, he'd been conducting his own investigation. He managed to examine debris from a destroyed Martian cylinder using equipment at the university. What he found was both fascinating and horrifying. The Martian technology was millions of years more advanced than ours. The metal of their machines was an alloy unknown to human science, capable of dispersing heat and kinetic energy instantly. But that wasn't the worst of it. He found traces of what could only be described as a biological weapon, microscopic organisms that attacked human tissue with terrifying efficiency. The Martians weren't just invading to conquer. They were preparing to terraform Earth itself. By the 3rd day, the tripods had adapted their tactics. They'd learned to spread out, to coordinate their attacks. One group would draw military forces to engage, while another would circle around and strike from behind. They learned to target bridges, railways, and communication lines first. They were cutting us off from each other, isolating population centers to be picked off one by one. The radio broadcasts became increasingly sporadic. Stations would go live, transmit for a few minutes, then fall silent forever. The pattern was always the same. Excited voices reporting that help was coming, that the military had a plan. Then the distant sound of the heat ray, screams and static. Professor Caldwell, released from detention when the military police simply abandoned their posts to flee, returned to his observatory one last time. The Martian cylinders had stopped falling 2 days ago, which meant this was likely all of them, perhaps 50 cylinders spread across the globe, each berthing multiple tripods. Through his telescope, he could see Mars clearly in the night sky, that red point of light that had haunted human imagination for thousands of years. He wondered if the Martians had left anyone behind, or if their entire civilization had embarked on this desperate exodus. Either way, Earth was losing. He'd just finished his calculations, grim mathematics that suggested humanity had perhaps 2 weeks before organized resistance became impossible, when he heard a new sound. Not the heat ray's distinctive hum, not the thunderous footfalls of the tripods, but something else, something from the sky. He rushed outside and looked up. There, silhouetted against the moon, were more cylinders falling. But these were smaller, perhaps only 20 feet long instead of the massive 100-foot vessels that had first landed. And they were falling everywhere. Thousands of them, like a meteor shower, but too uniform, too deliberate. Professor Caldwell understood immediately what he was seeing. The first wave had been the military. These were the colonists. The Martians weren't just invading Earth. They were moving here. All of them. What happens when the colonist cylinders land? Will humanity find a way to fight back? Or are we witnessing the end of human civilization? Join us tomorrow evening for Part 4 of The Red Planet Rising. Until then, hold tight to hope, friends. Even in our darkest stories, there's always a chance for a new dawn. This is Tales Beyond Tomorrow, brought to you by Purity Supreme Coffee. Good night.
This is Dr. Hugh Martin with an urgent public health advisory from the Iowa State Health Department. Due to the ongoing influenza outbreak in Kossuth County and surrounding areas, the following emergency health measures are now in effect. Citizens are advised to avoid all public gatherings of more than 10 persons until further notice. This includes church services, social events, and community meetings. Schools in the affected area will remain closed through the remainder of the week. If you encounter any individuals showing signs of severe illness, particularly high fever combined with aggressive or confused behavior, do not approach them directly. Instead, contact local law enforcement or medical authorities immediately. Several citizens have been injured attempting to assist affected individuals, and we stress that only trained medical personnel should handle these cases. Families are reminded to report any deaths to proper authorities immediately, and under no circumstances should bodies be moved or handled by family members. State health officials will coordinate all burial arrangements during this emergency period. Any unusual activity in rural areas, particularly involving individuals who appear disoriented or are behaving erratically, should be reported to the county sheriff's department without delay. Citizens are advised that approaching such individuals, even if they appear to be known family members or neighbors, may pose serious health risks. This emergency advisory will remain in effect until the current outbreak has been fully contained. We ask for the full cooperation of all residents in following these guidelines to protect both individual and community health.
Homeowners, is your yard overrun with unsightly problems? Call Lionel's Lawn Care Service. We handle the messiest situations with our industrial strength equipment. From overgrown gardens to pest control, we clean up what others won't touch. Our motto, no job too messy, no problem too gruesome. Lionel's Lawn Care. We'll make your property look alive again. Before we conclude tonight's broadcast, we have received a letter from Mrs. Anna Brenner of rural Algona, Iowa, which was forwarded to our newsroom by her sister in Des Moines. Mrs. Brenner asked that her account be shared with the wider public. The letter, dated 3 days ago, reads as follows. To whoever might listen, my name is Anna Brenner, and I live on a farm 12 miles south of Algona. I'm writing this because I don't know who else to tell, and the authorities keep saying things that don't match what I've seen with my own eyes. My husband Carl took sick 8 days ago with what the doctor said was influenza, high fever, terrible sweats, and toward the end he got violent and tried to bite me and our boy Tommy. We had to tie him to the bed, which broke my heart, but he wasn't himself anymore. Carl passed on Tuesday morning, and we laid him out proper in the front parlor like we did for his father. But that evening, after the undertaker had already come and gone, I heard sounds from downstairs. When I went to look, Carl was standing by the window, still in his burial clothes, trying to get outside. I called his name, but he just turned and looked at me with eyes that weren't Carl's anymore. Then he started walking toward me, slow but determined, with his hands reaching out like he wanted to grab me. I ran upstairs and barricaded Tommy and myself in the bedroom. We could hear him walking around the house all night, bumping into furniture and making this low moaning sound. In the morning he was gone, but I found the kitchen door standing wide open. That was 3 days ago, and I keep seeing him in the fields at night, wandering around like he's looking for something. I buried Carl with my own 2 hands yesterday morning, but I swear I saw him again last night near the barn. The authorities won't listen, keep saying it's grief playing tricks on my mind. But I know my husband, living and dead. Something terrible wrong is happening here. Mrs. Brenner's letter was dated 4 days ago. Attempts to contact her for follow-up have been unsuccessful, as telephone service to that area has been temporarily disrupted. State health officials remind us that grief can manifest in many ways and encourage anyone experiencing similar distressing thoughts to contact their local physician or minister. This concludes our evening broadcast. Good night from all of us at CBS Radio. Mechanics and hot rod enthusiasts, Cherry Automotive Parts has everything you need to soup up your ride. From high-performance engines to custom exhaust systems, we'll help you build a machine that can handle any road condition. Our parts are so durable, they'll keep running even when everything else falls apart. Cherry Automotive, built to survive whatever comes your way. Good evening. This is Frank McLeod with the CBS Radio Evening News from New York. Tonight we bring you disturbing reports from our overseas bureaus, where similar medical emergencies to those we've been following in Iowa are now being reported across liberated Europe. What began as isolated incidents in the American Midwest may, according to international correspondents, be part of a much larger pattern affecting Allied-occupied territories. Cable reports received this afternoon from London, Paris, and Moscow describe outbreaks of aggressive illness in areas where German concentration camps and research facilities have been liberated by Allied forces. The symptoms described in these international dispatches bear striking similarities to the cases we've been reporting from Kossuth County, Iowa, raising questions about whether these incidents are connected by more than mere coincidence. British authorities in the Hamburg sector report 17 cases of what they term severe neurological inflammation among personnel involved in the cleanup of German medical facilities. French officials describe similar cases near the former Natzweiler camp, while Soviet medical officers have reportedly requested emergency supplies of restraints and sedatives for use in their occupation zone. We now go live to our correspondent, Fred Dobbs.
Thank you, Frank. I'm speaking to you tonight from the State Department here in Washington, where officials have been quietly receiving troubling cables from American diplomatic posts across Europe. While these reports have not been made public until now, the pattern they describe suggests a coordination of events that extends far beyond American borders. A classified cable from the American Embassy in London, portions of which have been declassified for this broadcast, describes incidents at the Bergen-Belsen campsite where British forces have been conducting cleanup operations. The cable states, medical officer reports unprecedented cases of violent delirium among work details. 3 fatalities have occurred, but personnel continue to report sightings of the deceased individuals in camp areas previously declared. Similarly troubling reports have arrived from Paris, where French authorities are dealing with what they describe as an epidemic of aggressive madness among workers dismantling German research installations in Alsace. Dr. Maurice Chabelier, chief medical officer for the French occupation forces, cabled Washington that the afflicted demonstrate an unusual fixation on biting behavior and appear to retain some form of motor function even after clinical death has been pronounced. Most concerning are fragmentary reports from the Soviet zone, where American intelligence sources indicate that Red Army medical units have established what they term special isolation facilities for cases exhibiting what Soviet doctors call reanimation syndrome. While details from Soviet-controlled areas remain limited, refugees crossing into the American sector describe mass graves that will not stay quiet and work details armed with clubs and axes rather than conventional tools. Back to you, Frank.
Thank you, Fred. We're joined now by Dr. Jefferson Smith from the Army Medical Research Command, who has been analyzing reports from these various international incidents.
Thank you, Frank. What we're observing across multiple Allied zones appears to be connected to the liberation of German research facilities, particularly those involved in what we now understand were experimental medical programs conducted by Nazi scientists. Our analysis suggests that German researchers may have been experimenting with biological agents designed to create what they termed resilient soldiers, individuals who could continue fighting effectiveness even after sustaining normally fatal injuries. While these experiments were clearly unsuccessful in their intended purpose, they appear to have produced an unintended biological effect that we're now encountering in liberated areas. The common factor linking incidents in Iowa, Britain, France, and the Soviet zone appears to be exposure to materials or personnel recovered from German medical facilities. This includes not only scientific equipment and specimens, but also prisoners of war and civilian personnel who may have been subjects of these experimental programs. What we're dealing with appears to be a form of biological contamination that affects the nervous system, causing extreme aggression and disrupting normal death processes. The affected individuals seem to retain basic motor functions even after clinical death, though their behavior becomes entirely primitive and driven by apparent hunger or aggression. I must emphasize that our understanding of this phenomenon remains preliminary. We're working closely with British and French medical authorities to develop effective containment and treatment protocols. The Soviet Union has been less cooperative in sharing information, but we believe they're dealing with similar challenges in their occupation zone. The critical factor appears to be preventing further exposure to contaminated materials and ensuring proper isolation of affected individuals until we can develop more effective treatment methods.
Dr. Smith, that analysis is deeply concerning. The State Department announced this evening that they will be coordinating with Allied governments to establish joint protocols for handling materials recovered from German research facilities. President Truman has been briefed on these international developments, and the White House indicates that additional resources will be allocated to medical research efforts aimed at understanding and containing what officials are now calling post-liberation syndrome. The War Department has issued new guidelines for American occupation forces regarding the handling of German scientific materials, with enhanced safety protocols now required for all personnel involved in facility cleanup operations. Medical screening will be mandatory for all American servicemen returning from duty in areas where German research installations have been discovered. International health authorities are establishing communication channels to share information about treatment methods and containment strategies, though Soviet cooperation remains limited due to ongoing political tensions in the occupation zones. The scope of this crisis appears to extend far beyond what we initially understood when reporting on isolated incidents in Iowa. We'll continue to monitor international developments and bring you updates as this story unfolds across multiple continents. Coming up after the break, we'll have a report on new housing construction for returning veterans, followed by an update on steel production in the Pittsburgh region. This has been Frank McLeod for CBS Radio. We'll return in just a moment with more news from around the nation and the world. Then stay tuned for Tales Beyond Tomorrow, Part 4 of Orson Welles' gripping adventure, Red Planet Rising. Good evening.
Good evening, friends, and welcome back to Tales Beyond Tomorrow. Before we continue with Part 4 of the Red Planet Rising, let me assure you that Purity Supreme Coffee stands ready to fuel America's resistance, even if that resistance is, at present, only fictional. Now let us return to Earth's darkest hour. The smaller cylinders, the colonist vessels, as Professor Caldwell called them, began opening within hours of landing. What emerged was worse than anyone had imagined. These weren't just more Martians. These were civilians, if such a word applied to them. Smaller creatures, some appearing sickly or aged, others that might have been younglings. They moved with purpose, immediately beginning to spread a strange red weed that grew with impossible speed, choking out native vegetation and turning the landscape an alien crimson. But the Martians had one more horror to unveil. On the 5th day, the tripods began releasing what survivors would come to call the black smoke. It happened first in Boston. Dr. Doyle, who had retreated to a basement laboratory beneath the university, heard the reports over his shortwave radio. A tripod had positioned itself on the outskirts of the city and began spraying a thick, oily vapor into the air. The wind carried it through the streets, between buildings, into homes and shelters. Where the black smoke touched, people died. Not burned, not vaporized like with the heat ray, but simply collapsed, their lungs destroyed from the inside. The smoke was heavier than air, creeping into basements and tunnels where people had taken shelter. It clung to everything, staining the world black, and remained toxic for hours after release. Within a day, Boston was silent. A city of 700,000 reduced to a tomb. The pattern repeated in Philadelphia, then Baltimore, then Washington itself. The government, what remained of it, had already evacuated to undisclosed locations further west. The military was in full retreat, trying to regroup behind the Mississippi River while the Martians methodically cleared the eastern seaboard. Professor Caldwell had joined a group of survivors hiding in the metro tunnels beneath the city. There were perhaps 200 of them, men, women, children, living in the dark with dwindling supplies, listening to the footfalls of the tripods overhead. They could hear the Martians calling to each other, a sound like a foghorn mixed with a whale's song, echoing through the dead city above. One young man, a soldier who'd lost his entire platoon, spoke of what he'd seen on the front lines. He described how the Martians had started harvesting. They would gather humans, those who hadn't died from the heat ray or black smoke, and take them aboard the tripods. What happened to those people, no one knew. But the soldier had noticed something. The Martians never took the sick or injured. Dr. Doyle, listening to this account over the shortwave, suddenly understood. He'd been analyzing the biological samples for days, trying to understand the Martian physiology, when it clicked into place. The Martians weren't just terraforming Earth. They needed something from us, blood perhaps, or some other biological component. They were feeding. He tried to broadcast her findings, to warn others, but the radio waves were jammed with static and Martian signals, that pulsing rhythmic sound that drilled into the skull and made concentration impossible. The world had become fragmented, isolated, pockets of humanity scattered across the landscape, each unaware if any others still survived. On the 8th day, Professor Caldwell made a decision. He couldn't hide in the dark anymore, waiting to die. He would go above ground, observe the Martians up close, and try to find some weakness. The others tried to stop him, but the old astronomer was determined. He'd spent his life studying Mars. Perhaps he could learn something that would help. He emerged from the metro at dawn into a city he no longer recognized. The red weed had overtaken everything, growing up the sides of buildings, covering the streets like a crimson carpet. The air smelled strange, metallic and sharp. In the distance, he could see 3 tripods standing motionless, like sentries. Caldwell moved carefully through the ruins, notebook in hand, recording everything. The Martian machines, the alien vegetation, the strange devices they'd set up at intersections. He was so focused on his observations that he almost didn't notice the Martian standing right in front of him. It wasn't in a tripod. It was on the ground, alone, examining a piece of human machinery, a car, smashed and burned. The creature turned those great luminous eyes toward him, and Professor Caldwell found himself frozen, unable to run, unable to even breathe. They regarded each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, the Martian made a sound. Not the terrible shriek from before, but something softer, almost inquisitive. It extended one of its tentacles toward him, and that's when the Martian collapsed. It simply fell over, its tentacles twitching, that beak opening and closing soundlessly. Caldwell watched in amazement as the creature shuddered once, twice, and then lay still, dead. He heard more sounds, the foghorn calls of other Martians, but they sounded different now, distressed, confused. He looked toward the tripods in the distance and saw one tilting, wobbling before it crashed to the ground with a tremendous noise. Something was happening to the Martians, something unexpected. What force could fell the mighty Martian invaders? Could humanity dare to hope? Join us tomorrow evening for the thrilling conclusion of the Red Planet Rising. Until then, remember, friends, the smallest things can sometimes change the course of history. This is Tales Beyond Tomorrow, brought to you by Purity Supreme Coffee. Good night.
We interrupt our regular programming for a special address from the President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman.
My fellow Americans, this is your President speaking to you tonight from the Oval Office on a matter of utmost importance to our nation and to our allies around the world. As you may have heard in recent news reports, American medical authorities have been investigating unusual health incidents in several of our communities, particularly those near military installations where we have been processing personnel and materials recovered from defeated Germany. I want to speak to you directly about what we know, what we are doing, and what I am asking of each and every American citizen. Our medical experts, working with the finest scientific minds in our nation, have determined that we are dealing with the aftermath of secret German biological experiments conducted during the final phases of the war. These experiments, designed to create what Nazi scientists called resilient warfare capabilities, have left behind contaminated materials and affected individuals that pose ongoing challenges to public health and safety. The enemy we face today is not the German army or Nazi ideology, but the poisonous legacy of their twisted scientific pursuits. This contamination has affected not only American communities, but also our British and French allies, and we have reason to believe it extends into Soviet-occupied territories as well. I want to be clear with you. The affected individuals pose a genuine danger to public safety. They exhibit extreme aggression, appear to be driven by primitive impulses, and continue to present risks even after what would normally be considered fatal conditions. This is not a matter of mental illness or war trauma. This is biological contamination that requires immediate and decisive action, effective immediately. I am authorizing the establishment of specialized medical containment facilities in affected areas. The National Guard will assist local authorities in maintaining quarantine zones and ensuring public safety. Federal medical teams are being deployed to work alongside local health care providers in identifying and isolating affected individuals. I am asking for the full cooperation of every American citizen in this effort. If you encounter individuals exhibiting the symptoms our health officials have described, extreme aggression, unusual behavior, or apparent continuation of activity after severe injury, do not attempt to help them yourself. Contact local authorities immediately and maintain a safe distance. To our allies in Britain and France, and to the Soviet Union, I say this: we face a common threat that requires our combined scientific and medical resources. Political differences must not prevent us from sharing information and coordinating our response to this biological legacy of Nazi evil. The American people have faced great challenges before, and we have always emerged stronger through unity, determination, and faith in our democratic institutions. We defeated the Nazi war machine on the battlefield, and we will defeat this final weapon of their twisted science through American ingenuity and resolve. I have directed our medical research establishment to make this their highest priority, with unlimited resources at their disposal. We will find answers, we will develop treatments, and we will protect the American people from this unseen enemy, just as we protected them from fascist armies. Until that time, I ask for your patience, your cooperation, and your continued faith in American leadership. Follow the guidance of local health officials. Support your neighbors and communities. And remember that we are strongest when we stand together. We face a new and unseen foe, but we do not face it alone. May God bless you. May God bless our efforts to overcome this challenge. And may God bless the United States of America. Good night, and remain vigilant.
That was President Harry S. Truman speaking from the White House. We'll return you now to your regularly scheduled programming, but please stay tuned to this station for any further emergency announcements from federal authorities. This is Frank McCloud for CBS Radio. Good evening. Shoppers, when you need quality tools for home improvement or emergency situations, visit Ash's Hardware and Housewares. We carry everything from chainsaws to shotguns, and our helpful staff can recommend the right tool for any job. Located in the heart of downtown, we've been serving this community's hardware needs for generations. Ash's Hardware. Shop smart. Shop S-Mart. Good evening. This is Frank McCloud with the CBS Radio Emergency News Bulletin from New York. We interrupt regular programming to bring you breaking news from multiple American cities, where the biological contamination crisis that began in rural communities has now spread to major urban areas with devastating consequences. In the past 6 hours, we have received reports of violent outbreaks in hospitals across Philadelphia, Boston, Detroit, and here in New York City. What began as isolated medical emergencies has escalated into situations requiring immediate police and military intervention, with several facilities reporting that their morgues and emergency wards have been completely overrun by individuals exhibiting the aggressive symptoms we have been following in recent broadcasts. Most alarming are confirmed reports that police units in these cities have been forced to open fire on affected individuals in public areas, with witnesses describing scenes of chaos as law enforcement struggles to contain what can only be described as a complete breakdown of normal medical and social order. The mayor of Philadelphia has declared a state of emergency, while similar declarations are expected momentarily in other affected cities. We now go live to our correspondent in the field.
Thank you, Frank. I'm reporting from outside Philadelphia General Hospital, where the situation remains extremely dangerous despite the arrival of National Guard units 2 hours ago. What happened here early this morning represents a complete collapse of the containment measures that health officials assured us would be sufficient to handle this crisis. Dr. Sarah Connor, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Philadelphia General, described the outbreak that began at approximately 4 a.m. We had been treating 7 patients with the neurological symptoms, keeping them in isolation as per federal guidelines, but around 4 o'clock, we started hearing screams from the morgue in the basement. When security went to investigate, they found that bodies we had pronounced dead during the night were moving around, trying to bite anyone who came near them. The situation rapidly deteriorated when these reanimated individuals broke free from the morgue and began attacking patients and staff throughout the hospital. Nurse Patricia Hayes, who escaped through a third-floor window, told me it wasn't like anything human anymore. Mr. Williams from room 302, who died yesterday from the fever, came walking down the hallway, dragging his broken leg behind him. His skin was gray and cold, but he was moving and making these terrible hungry sounds. When he grabbed Orderly Jackson, he bit right through the man's throat. Philadelphia police arrived within minutes of the first emergency calls, but found their standard procedures completely inadequate for the situation they encountered. Captain Vincent Perry of the 12th Precinct reported, "We shot at least 15 of these things, center mass shots that should have dropped them immediately, but they kept coming until we started aiming for the head. Only headshots seemed to stop them permanently." Similar scenes have unfolded across multiple cities, with hospitals in Boston reporting that their entire morgue facility has been evacuated, while Detroit police have established a 3-block quarantine zone around City Hospital after what they describe as multiple aggressive individuals broke free from medical containment and began attacking civilians on the street. Back to you, Frank.
Thank you, Fred. We're joined now by Dr. John Ferguson, recently returned from consultations with medical authorities in the affected cities, who can provide his assessment of what appears to be a complete failure of our containment efforts.
Frank, I must be completely candid with the American people about what we're facing tonight. What we're dealing with is no longer a medical emergency that can be handled through conventional healthcare protocols. The German biological contamination has created a condition that fundamentally alters the relationship between life and death as we understand it. The affected individuals retain basic motor function and display primitive aggressive behavior even after clinical death has occurred. They appear to be driven by what can only be described as an overwhelming compulsion to bite and attack living persons. Once bitten by an affected individual, the victim invariably develops the same neurological symptoms, progresses to apparent death, and then reanimates with identical aggressive behavior. Most critically, we have confirmed that only severe trauma to the head or complete destruction of brain tissue will permanently stop these individuals. Conventional injuries, even those that would be immediately fatal to a normal person, do not prevent their continued aggressive behavior. This explains why police units have been forced to adopt what they describe as headshot protocols. The rate of transmission appears to be accelerating exponentially. Each bitten individual becomes a new source of infection within hours, and our hospital systems are completely unprepared to handle patients who continue to present dangers even after death. Standard morgue facilities have become breeding grounds for the spread of this contamination. I must emphasize that we are no longer dealing with sick people who need medical care. These are individuals whose biological functions have been fundamentally altered by German experimentation, and they pose an immediate lethal threat to any living person they encounter. Traditional medical ethics and procedures are not applicable to this situation.
Dr. Ferguson, that assessment is deeply troubling, but appears to match the reports we're receiving from multiple cities tonight. The President has been briefed on the rapidly deteriorating situation, and we expect to hear from the White House within the hour regarding federal emergency measures. The National Guard has been activated in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Michigan, and New York. with guard units receiving what military officials describe as specialized rules of engagement for dealing with affected individuals. We understand these rules emphasize the protection of uninfected civilians as the primary objective. All hospitals in the affected cities have been ordered to implement immediate cremation protocols for any individuals who succumb to the neurological symptoms, with federal health officials acknowledging that traditional burial practices may contribute to the spread of contamination. Families are being advised that normal funeral procedures will not be possible during this emergency period. Transportation authorities have suspended rail and bus service to the affected metropolitan areas, while state police have established checkpoints on major highways to monitor the movement of potentially infected individuals. Citizens are advised to avoid all unnecessary travel and to remain in their homes if they live in or near affected communities. This situation appears to represent the complete failure of the containment measures that federal officials assured us would be sufficient to handle the German biological legacy. We face a crisis unlike anything in our nation's history, requiring responses that challenge every assumption about medical care and public safety. We'll continue our emergency coverage throughout the night as this crisis unfolds. Stay tuned for further updates and official government announcements as they become available. This is Frank McLeod for CBS Radio, reporting on what may be the darkest night in American history since the Civil War. God help us all.
This is Reverend Matthew Jacobs speaking to you tonight from what remains of our congregation here in Atlanta. Though I confess the Lord's house feels smaller and more fragile with each passing hour. My brothers and sisters in Christ, we face a trial that tests not only our faith, but our very understanding of God's divine order. Tonight, as reports reach us of the dead walking in our great cities, of hospitals become charnel houses, of our fellow Americans forced to take up arms against what were once their neighbors and loved ones, we must ask ourselves, what hath man wrought in his arrogance? Scripture tells us in the book of Ecclesiastes, for that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts, even one thing befalleth them, as the one dieth, so dieth the other. But what of those times when death itself becomes uncertain, when the grave cannot hold what should rest in peace, when man's evil science has torn asunder the very fabric of the Lord's natural law? I speak to you tonight not with easy comfort, but with the terrible truth that we are witnessing the consequences of human pride and scientific blasphemy. The Germans, in their godless pursuit of power, have violated the sacred boundary between life and death that the Almighty established at the foundation of the world. And now we all, innocent and guilty alike, reap the whirlwind of their ungodly experimentation. But hear me clearly. This is not the end of days foretold in Revelation, though it may feel as such in our darkest hours. This is man's sin made manifest, the poisonous fruit of those who would play God with the very essence of life itself. The walking dead in our streets are not risen by divine will, but by human wickedness that has corrupted the natural order. To those who face these abominations, to our police officers and soldiers who must take up arms against what were once their fellow men, I say this: you do not sin when you destroy what is already an affront to God's creation. These are no longer our loved ones, no longer bearers of the divine spark that makes us human. They are the corrupted shells of the dead, animated by German poison, and putting them to final rest is an act of mercy, not murder. The Lord gave us dominion over life and death through his divine wisdom, and when man corrupts that sacred trust, we must act to restore his righteous order. Destroy the brain, our medical authorities tell us, and I say yes, destroy what German science has profaned, and let the souls thus trapped find their way to the Lord's eternal judgment. Pray for our afflicted cities tonight. Pray for those who must make terrible choices in these terrible hours. And pray that God's justice will ultimately triumph over man's scientific abomination, as it surely must. For the Lord shall not be mocked, and his natural law shall not be forever violated by human pride. May the Almighty protect the innocent, strengthen the righteous, and bring swift end to this plague that man's evil has unleashed upon our nation. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. This is Reverend Matthew Jacobs. May God preserve us through this night of tribulation.
City folks looking for a peaceful mountain getaway? Book your vacation at Tucker and Dale's Mountain Retreat. Our rustic cabin offers all the privacy you need, surrounded by beautiful West Virginia wilderness, perfect for college groups or anyone wanting to get away from civilization. Tucker and Dale's, where hillbilly hospitality meets mountain adventure. When you've lost a loved one, trust return to Riverside Cemetery Services for dignified burial arrangements. Our experienced staff handles all aspects of interment with care and professionalism. We guarantee your departed will rest in peace permanently. Special services available for unusual circumstances. Return to Riverside, where the dead stay dead. This is Frank McCloud with CBS Radio, broadcasting from our emergency studio in Newark, New Jersey. At 6 p.m. Eastern Time tonight, President Truman signed Executive Order 9877, declaring a national state of emergency and imposing martial law in 17 states across the northeastern and midwestern United States. Under the emergency powers granted by this order, military commanders now hold complete authority over civilian movement, transportation, and communication in the affected regions. All constitutional protections regarding search and seizure, freedom of assembly, and due process have been suspended indefinitely in areas where the biological contamination has been confirmed or suspected. The President's order authorizes the immediate evacuation of major population centers, beginning with Manhattan, downtown Philadelphia, central Boston, and the Detroit metropolitan area. Citizens in these zones have been given 4 hours to gather essential belongings and report to designated assembly points, where they will be transported to internment facilities established in rural areas for medical screening and quarantine. Most disturbingly, the order grants military personnel unlimited authority to use lethal force against any individuals exhibiting symptoms of biological contamination, with no requirement for warning or attempts at apprehension. General Omar Bradley announced that all military units have been issued what he terms standing engagement protocols that prioritize the protection of uninfected populations above all other considerations. We now go live to our correspondent in the field, Fred Dobbs, reporting from the evacuation zone in Manhattan.
Frank, I'm reporting from the Manhattan evacuation zone, where scenes of chaos and heartbreak are unfolding as families are forced to make impossible decisions in the face of immediate military orders. National Guard units moved into position at 7 p.m., establishing checkpoints at every bridge and tunnel leading off the island, while loudspeakers mounted on military vehicles broadcast evacuation instructions in multiple languages. The process has been complicated by the requirement that every evacuee submit to immediate medical examination before being permitted to leave the quarantine zone. Anyone displaying elevated temperature, recent injuries, or what medical personnel describe as behavioral irregularities is immediately separated from their family members and taken to what officials term specialized observation facilities. Mrs. Helen Morrison from the Upper West Side described the agonizing choice she faced at the 79th Street checkpoint. My husband, Charles, had been feeling poorly for 2 days, just a slight fever and some confusion. But when the Army doctor examined him, they said he couldn't come with me and the children. They put him in a truck with 12 other people, all of them looking scared and sick. I don't know if I'll ever see him again. The separation protocols have resulted in heart-wrenching scenes as families are torn apart based on medical assessments that often take less than 30 seconds per individual. Children are being separated from parents, spouses from each other, with no appeals process and no information provided about where the separated individuals are being taken. Captain Richard Mason, commanding the evacuation at the Lincoln Tunnel, defended the harsh measures. We've seen what happens when even one infected individual reaches an uncontaminated population. Within hours, you have dozens of new cases. Within days, entire communities are overrun. We cannot allow sentiment to override the survival of the uninfected majority. More troubling are reports from evacuees about the methods being used to handle individuals who are deemed too symptomatic to evacuate safely. Multiple witnesses have described hearing gunshots from the specialized observation areas, though military officials refuse to comment on containment procedures for advanced cases. Back to you, Frank.
Thank you, Fred. We're joined now by Peggy Stephenson, a nurse who has been working with military medical units during the evacuation process and who can provide insight into the medical protocols being employed.
Frank, I want to be clear about what we're facing in these evacuation zones. The medical screening process, while heartbreaking to witness, is based on hard evidence about how this contamination spreads and how quickly it can overwhelm any attempt at containment. We've learned that the incubation period between infection and the onset of aggressive symptoms can be as little as 6 hours, and individuals may be contagious even before they display obvious signs of illness. A person who seems perfectly healthy at morning screening may be attacking fellow evacuees by evening, turning a safe transport into a death trap within hours. The separation of families is the most difficult aspect of our work, but we've seen what happens when infected individuals are allowed to remain with uncontaminated family members. The Detroit evacuation convoy was attacked from within when 3 infected evacuees reanimated during transport. 17 people died before military escorts could regain control, including children who were bitten by their own infected relatives. As for the reports of gunshots from observation areas, I can confirm that individuals who progress to the final stages of contamination must be dealt with immediately and decisively. There is no treatment, no cure, and no possibility of recovery once the neurological symptoms reach their conclusion. The choice is between a quick, merciful end and allowing them to become a threat to everyone around them. The military personnel making these decisions are not monsters. They're young men and women trying to save as many lives as possible in an impossible situation. Every infected individual who is allowed to progress to reanimation represents dozens of potential new victims. The mathematics of survival are harsh but undeniable. I've been a nurse for 15 years, and everything I learned about preserving life and dignity has been turned upside down by this crisis. But I've also seen entire communities wiped out because someone couldn't make the hard choice when it mattered. The evacuation protocols may seem cruel, but they're the only thing standing between us and complete societal collapse.
Nurse Stephenson, we appreciate your candid assessment of these difficult circumstances. The War Department has announced that evacuation operations will continue through the night, with additional military units being deployed from bases across the southern and western United States to assist with transportation and quarantine enforcement. President Truman addressed the nation again at 9 p.m., acknowledging that the measures being implemented represent the most severe restriction of American freedoms in our nation's history, but emphasizing that the survival of our democracy depends upon our willingness to make impossible choices in impossible times. The president also announced that Congress will convene an emergency session in Denver, Colorado, which has been designated as the temporary seat of federal government, while Washington, D.C. undergoes precautionary evacuation and decontamination procedures. The Supreme Court has been relocated to Salt Lake City, while essential federal agencies are being distributed across multiple secure locations. International reaction to the American crisis has been swift. with Canada closing its border to all U.S. travelers, while Mexico has established a 100-mile quarantine zone along the Rio Grande. Britain and France have suspended all transatlantic shipping and air service, effectively isolating the United States until the contamination crisis can be resolved. We're receiving reports that similar evacuation procedures are being implemented in affected areas of Europe, though details remain limited due to military censorship in the Allied occupation zones. The American Red Cross estimates that over 2 million citizens are now in federal quarantine facilities, with that number expected to double within the next 48 hours as evacuation operations expand to include suburban and rural areas where contamination has been detected. We'll continue our emergency broadcasts throughout the night, providing updates on evacuation procedures and government announcements as they become available. This is Frank McLeod for CBS Radio, broadcasting from what may be one of the final free radio stations in the northeastern United States. And now, even in these troubled hours, we bring you a brief escape from the fear outside, Tales Beyond Tomorrow, the fifth and final chapter of Orson Welles' Red Planet Rising. May God protect our nation through this darkest hour.
This is General Douglas MacArthur, Emergency Directive 7 Alpha from the Federal Emergency Management Authority. All citizens in designated evacuation zones are hereby ordered to comply immediately with military evacuation directives. Resistance to evacuation orders or failure to report to designated assembly points constitutes a federal crime punishable by immediate detention. Any individual displaying symptoms of biological contamination, including fever above 101 degrees, recent unexplained injuries, or unusual behavioral patterns, must be reported to military personnel immediately. Failure to report suspected contamination, including among family members, constitutes a threat to public safety and will be prosecuted to the full extent of martial law. Citizens are advised that any bitten persons must be surrendered to military medical authorities within 1 hour of injury. Attempts to conceal bite injuries or hide infected individuals will result in immediate quarantine of entire family units and possible criminal prosecution. No exceptions will be made for family relationships or emotional considerations. This directive is effective immediately and will remain in force until the biological contamination crisis has been resolved. Compliance is mandatory and non-negotiable.
This is Nova Hayes with an emergency bulletin from the American Red Cross Disaster Coordination Center. Due to the rapidly evolving crisis, the Red Cross is suspending all traditional humanitarian assistance protocols in affected areas. Red Cross personnel are no longer authorized to provide direct medical care to individuals displaying symptoms of biological contamination. Our volunteers have been instructed to maintain minimum distances of 50 feet from potentially infected persons and to immediately notify military authorities rather than attempt rescue or treatment operations.
Families seeking information about separated relatives should contact the Federal Evacuation Registry at the phone numbers being broadcast by local military authorities. However, citizens should understand that information about individuals taken to specialized observation facilities may not be available due to security classifications. The Red Cross has established emergency supply depots at all federal quarantine camps, but we cannot guarantee adequate resources for the rapidly expanding evacuee population. Citizens are advised to bring sufficient food, water, and medical supplies for at least 2 weeks when reporting to evacuation assembly points.
Due to the extreme danger posed by contaminated individuals, the Red Cross cannot provide search and rescue services in quarantined urban areas. Citizens remaining in evacuation zones do so at their own risk and cannot expect emergency assistance if they encounter infected individuals. The Red Cross will resume normal humanitarian operations only when military authorities determine it is safe to do so. Until that time, survival is the responsibility of individual citizens and their immediate communities.
Business owners need reliable freight transport. Cargo Hold Shipping Company delivers your goods safely across the country, no matter how remote the destination. We specialize in secure transport of sensitive materials and guarantee your cargo arrives intact. Our drivers are trained to handle dangerous roads and hostile conditions. Cargo Hold Shipping. We keep America moving, dead or alive.
This is General Douglas MacArthur, Commanding General of Federal Emergency Operations, with a final directive to all citizens in affected regions. Effective at midnight tonight, all civilian movement within quarantine zones is prohibited without specific military authorization. Anyone found outside designated safe areas after this deadline will be considered potentially contaminated and will be subject to immediate neutralization protocols. Military units have been authorized to shoot on sight any individuals exhibiting aggressive behavior or attempting to breach quarantine perimeters. No warnings will be given and no exceptions will be made for civilians claiming to be uncontaminated. Citizens who have not yet reported to evacuation assembly points have 12 hours to do so. After midnight, anyone remaining in quarantine zones will be presumed to be either infected or in violation of federal emergency orders. The United States military takes no pleasure in these extreme measures, but the survival of our nation depends upon absolute compliance with contamination protocols. We have seen entire cities fall within hours when these procedures are not followed precisely. To the American people outside the affected zones, support your government, follow all federal guidelines, and remember that your continued freedom depends upon our ability to contain this biological threat before it spreads further. God help us all. This is General Douglas MacArthur. Good night, America.
Pet owners, does your dog have trouble following commands? Bring him to Bub's Pet Training Academy. Our unique methods work even with the most stubborn animals. We specialize in teaching basic obedience, sit, stay, and simple tasks. Bub's Pet Training Academy, teaching old dogs new tricks since 1932.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to the final installment of the Red Planet Rising. Purity Supreme Coffee thanks you for joining us on this thrilling journey, and now let us conclude our tale. Professor Henry Caldwell stood in the crimson streets of a dead city, watching the Martian invaders die. They fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The great tripods toppled like trees in a storm, their alien pilots dead at the controls. The smaller colonist Martians simply collapsed where they stood, their strange bodies convulsing briefly before lying still. Within hours, it was over. The invasion that had brought humanity to its knees had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Dr. Thomas Doyle emerged from his laboratory when he heard the news spreading over the shortwave. He made his way through the ruins to examine the bodies, and what he found confirmed a hypothesis that had been forming in his mind for days. The Martians had been killed by Earth's bacteria. You see, Mars is a cold, dead world, sterile. The Martians had evolved in an environment utterly devoid of microbial life. They had no immune systems because they'd never needed them. When they came to Earth, teeming, wet, bacterial Earth, their bodies had no defense against the microscopic organisms that filled our air and water and soil. It had started slowly. The first Martians to land had lasted longer, their bodies gradually accumulating infections. But as more cylinders fell and more Martians emerged, the exposure accelerated. The very air they breathed, the ground they walked upon, the materials they touched, everything on Earth was hostile to them in ways their advanced technology couldn't protect against. Humanity had been saved by the smallest soldiers in existence. The bacteria and viruses that had plagued us for millennia had become our salvation. Professor Caldwell, standing among the dead Martians, felt no joy in the victory. He looked at the creatures, these desperate beings who had traveled across the void of space to escape some calamity on their dying world, and felt only sadness. They had been conquerors, yes, but they had also been refugees, and Earth, beautiful, poisonous Earth, had killed them all. The survivors began to emerge from their hiding places. The metro tunnels disgorged their frightened occupants. Families crept out from basements and ruins. The human race, battered but unbroken, took its first tentative steps into a changed world. The cleanup would take years. The red weed, deprived of the Martian machines that had cultivated it, began to die off. But it had fundamentally altered many ecosystems. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. The social order had collapsed. But humanity, resilient as always, would rebuild. Dr. Doyle salvaged what Martian technology he could, knowing that understanding it might be humanity's only insurance policy. If the Martians had come once, others might follow. Next time, Earth needed to be ready. Professor Caldwell returned to his observatory, or what remained of it. His telescope had been destroyed by a stray heat ray blast, but he didn't need it anymore. He could see Mars clearly in the evening sky, that red point of light, and he wondered if anyone remained there. Had the Martians sent their entire civilization in those cylinders? Or were there others still on that dying world, waiting for a signal that would never come? He would never know the answer. But he knew this. Humanity had been given a second chance. A reprieve bought not by our weapons or our courage, but by the humblest forms of life on our planet. It was a lesson in humility that he hoped the world would not forget. The Martian invasion had lasted just 10 days. But it had changed humanity forever. We were no longer alone in the universe, and we were no longer ignorant of the dangers that lurked beyond our small world. The age of looking up at the night sky with childlike wonder had ended. Now, when we looked at the stars, we did so with wary eyes, and perhaps that was the real invasion, not of our cities or our land, but of our innocence. The Martians had taken that from us, and it could never be returned. The Earth turned. The sun rose, and humanity, as it always had, moved forward into an uncertain future. And so concludes our tale of the Red Planet Rising. I hope you've enjoyed this thrilling serial, friends. Remember, while the Martians may have been fictional, the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances is very real. In these troubled times, we must all find that courage within ourselves. This has been Tales Beyond Tomorrow, brought to you by Purity Supreme Coffee. The coffee that brings us together no matter what tomorrow may bring. Good night, friends, and keep watching the skies.
Attention photography enthusiasts, capture life's precious moments with Diary brand film and camera equipment. Our high-quality film stock preserves your memories in vivid detail, while our reliable cameras are built to document everything from family gatherings to historic events. When the world around you changes, Diary brand helps you record what matters most. Available at photography shops nationwide. Diary brand documenting the dead and the living since 1925. This is Frank McCloud with CBS Radio, broadcasting from our emergency station in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Tonight we bring you the most shocking revelation in this ongoing crisis, as captured German documents have been declassified by emergency order of the President, revealing the true scope and intentional nature of the biological contamination that has brought our nation to its knees. At 3 p.m. this afternoon, Army intelligence released portions of documents recovered from a hidden bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. Documents that expose what Nazi scientists called Projekt Totenauferstehung, Project Resurrection. These papers, authenticated by handwriting experts and cross-referenced with testimony from captured German scientists, reveal that the reanimation of the dead was not an accidental byproduct of medical experiments, but rather Hitler's intended final weapon against the Allied powers. The documents describe a deliberate program to create what German scientists termed unsterbliche Soldaten, immortal soldiers, who would continue fighting even after sustaining fatal wounds. When it became clear that Germany would lose the war, Nazi leadership ordered that contaminated specimens and infected personnel be deliberately dispersed among prisoner-of-war populations and scientific materials being captured by Allied forces. This was Germany's final act of revenge, a biological time bomb designed to detonate within the borders of their conquerors. The documents reveal that German scientists meticulously planned the concealment of this weapon within materials they knew Allied forces would eagerly capture. American intelligence agencies discovered warnings about unusual biological experiments in German facilities, but the Nazi scientists had expertly disguised the true nature of their research, making it appear to be conventional weapons development. We now go live to our correspondent Fred Dobbs, who is at the Pentagon.
Thank you, Frank. I'm reporting tonight from the Pentagon, where senior military officials have been in emergency session since the declassification of the German documents revealed the full extent of what can only be described as Nazi Germany's most diabolical weapon. The captured papers, written primarily by SS Oberfuhrer Dr. Klaus Weber, the chief of Nazi biological warfare research, detail a program that began in 1943 when German defeat became inevitable. Dr. Weber's journal, recovered from the Berlin bunker, contains this chilling passage. If the Third Reich cannot rule the world, then the world shall inherit our most perfect creation. Death itself shall become our ally in the final victory over our enemies. The documents reveal that German scientists successfully developed what they called Virus T, a biological agent that reanimates dead tissue and drives infected individuals to attack the living through biting behavior. The virus was designed to spread through bite transmission, creating an ever-expanding army of the infected that would overwhelm any military or civilian population. The German plan was methodical and cunning. Dr. Weber's notes detail how Nazi command deliberately seeded this contamination among prisoner-of-war populations and research materials, knowing that Allied forces would transport these materials home as spoils of war. Dr. Weber's notes state, "The Americans hunger for our scientific secrets. Very well. We shall give them knowledge that will consume them from within. They will carry our final weapon into the heart of their homeland and spread it among their own people." Colonel William Hayes, Army intelligence, confirmed that American forces did indeed recover extensive biological materials from German facilities, including live specimens that were transported to research installations in the United States. The Nazi deception was sophisticated and complete, Hayes stated. They created false documentation suggesting these were conventional weapons programs. We had no way of knowing we were dealing with a biological weapon specifically designed to destroy Allied populations. The timeline in the German documents matches exactly with the arrival of infected German scientists and contaminated materials at American ports, the same shipments we reported on in our earlier broadcasts when the crisis was just beginning. Back to you, Frank.
Thank you, Fred. We're joined now by Dr. Jefferson Smith from the Army Medical Research Command, who has been analyzing the German documents and can provide scientific context for these revelations.
Frank, the German documents confirm our worst fears about the nature of this contamination. What we're dealing with is not an accidental byproduct of medical research, but a deliberately engineered biological weapon designed specifically to create self-replicating armies of the infected dead. The Nazi scientists achieved what they called controlled reanimation by combining several different viral and bacterial agents that attack the nervous system while preserving basic motor function. The infected individual experiences fever, delirium, and eventual clinical death, but the brainstem remains active enough to drive primitive aggressive behavior focused entirely on biting and attacking living humans. Most diabolically, the German researchers designed the virus to be completely incurable once infection occurs. They wanted to ensure that any population exposed to their weapon would be completely overwhelmed, with no possibility of medical intervention or recovery. Every infected individual becomes a permanent threat that can only be stopped through complete destruction of brain tissue. The documents reveal that German scientists tested this weapon on prisoners in concentration camps, perfecting the transmission mechanisms and studying how quickly the infection could spread through confined populations. They found that a single infected individual could contaminate dozens of others within hours, and that infected populations would double every 12 to 18 hours until everyone was either dead or reanimated. The Nazi plan exploited the natural Allied desire to capture German scientific advances. Every outbreak we've reported, from the first incidents in Iowa to the fall of our major cities, can be traced directly to the materials and personnel that Nazi Germany deliberately allowed us to capture. This was biological warfare on a scale never before conceived, a weapon that would activate only after Germany's defeat, making it impossible to retaliate against its creators. We are not facing a medical emergency, Frank. We are the victims of the most sophisticated biological attack in human history, a weapon designed by Nazi Germany to ensure that their defeat would become our destruction.
Dr. Smith, that analysis reveals perhaps the most diabolical plan ever conceived by the Nazi regime. The President has announced that a full congressional investigation will be launched into how Nazi Germany successfully weaponized their own defeat, though such investigations may be academic given the current state of our nation. The German documents also reveal that similar contaminated materials were deliberately placed where they would be recovered by British, French, and Soviet forces, explaining the international scope of the crisis we reported in earlier broadcasts. Nazi Germany's final act of war was to ensure that their enemies would destroy themselves with captured German weapons. General Eisenhower issued a statement tonight acknowledging the extraordinary cunning of the Nazi bioweapons program and calling for international coordination to combat this German-engineered plague. The revelation that this crisis was deliberately engineered as a weapon of revenge adds a new dimension of horror to the collapse of American society that we are witnessing. We are not victims of scientific accident or natural plague, but casualties of Nazi Germany's final solution for the entire world. The documents suggest that Nazi leadership believed their biological weapon would eventually consume all Allied populations, leaving the world depopulated and ready for potential German survivors to reclaim. It was their final solution, not just for the Jewish people, but for everyone who opposed the Third Reich. As American cities burn and our people flee from the walking dead in the streets, we must face the terrible truth that Nazi Germany achieved in defeat what they could not accomplish in war, the destruction of Allied civilization. They turned their surrender into a weapon, their captured research into a plague, their defeat into our doom. This has been Frank McLeod for CBS Radio. We'll continue our broadcast for as long as possible, bringing you the truth about Nazi Germany's final and most terrible weapon. Good night, and may God have mercy on us all. Night shift workers and insomniacs, Juan's 24-hour diner never closes. Whether you need coffee at midnight or a full breakfast at dawn, we're here to serve you. Our Cuban-American menu features traditional favorites and revolutionary new dishes. Juan's 24-hour diner will keep you fed while the city sleeps. Before we conclude tonight's broadcast, I want to share with you a letter that arrived at our emergency station today, written by Private First Class Tommy Morrison of the 82nd Airborne, currently serving with evacuation forces in the Philadelphia quarantine zone. Private Morrison's letter provides a soldier's perspective on the terrible truth we have learned tonight. The letter is addressed to his sister in California and was forwarded to our newsroom by military postal censors who felt the American people should hear these words. It reads as follows. Dear Betty, I don't know if this letter will reach you, or if there will be anyone left to deliver it by the time it gets to California. But I needed to write this down, needed someone to know what we've learned out here about how this all started. You remember how proud we all were when the war ended? How we celebrated beating the Nazis and bringing their scientists back to help America stay strong? Well, turns out those Nazi bastards played the cruelest trick in history on us, Betty. A trick they'd been planning since they knew they were going to lose the war. I've been working cleanup in the cities where this plague hit hardest, and I've seen what those German monsters created. It wasn't an accident, Betty. They made this thing on purpose, designed it to spread like wildfire, and turn everyone into those walking corpses we've been fighting. They literally engineered a weapon to activate after their surrender. That's how evil these Nazi scientists were. The worst part is knowing how carefully they planned this. Every ship full of German prisoners they sent home with us, every crate of their scientific equipment they let us capture, every Nazi scientist who pretended to cooperate, they were all part of their revenge plan. They disguised their bioweapon as research we'd want to steal, knowing we'd bring it right into our cities. I've put down dozens of those things, Betty. Used to be Americans, used to be people with families and jobs and dreams. Now they're just hungry, walking nightmares that won't stop until you blow their brains out. And every single one of them died because Nazi Germany created a weapon specifically designed to kill us after they'd already surrendered. Yesterday, I had to shoot a little girl. Couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She'd been infected and reanimated, and she came at me with her teeth bared like a wild animal. I did what I had to do, but I keep thinking she died because Nazi Germany wanted revenge so badly they were willing to unleash hell on earth to get it. We're not fighting a disease, Betty. We're fighting Nazi Germany's final weapon, one designed to turn us into monsters and make us kill each other. Every person who gets bit becomes another soldier in Germany's final army, and that army is winning. I don't know if we can stop this thing, or if there will be anything left of America when it's over. But I want you to know that the boys out here are fighting as hard as we can, even though we're fighting a German bioweapon that was engineered to be unstoppable. If you don't hear from me again, remember that we tried our best to stop what Nazi Germany unleashed on the world, and if you survive this, don't ever let anyone forget how America fell. Not to German tanks or German bombs, but to a Nazi bioweapon so evil they designed it to kill us even after we'd beaten them in battle. Tell Ma I love her, and that I'm sorry we couldn't save her from the German plague. Your brother, Tommy. Private Morrison's letter was dated 5 days ago. His unit was reported missing yesterday during operations in downtown Philadelphia. Military officials list him as missing in action, presumed lost to enemy contact. His words stand as testament to the terrible cost of Nazi Germany's final act of revenge, and to the courage of our soldiers who continue fighting the most diabolical weapon ever created by the Third Reich. This is Frank McCloud for CBS Radio. May God grant that someone survives to remember how Nazi Germany tried to destroy the world, and why we must never forget their evil. Doctors and medical researchers, Reanimator Medical Supplies has the specialized equipment your practice needs. From surgical instruments to experimental research apparatus, we supply the tools that push the boundaries of medical science. Discreet delivery available for sensitive research projects. Reanimator Medical Supplies, bringing medicine back to life. This is Frank McCloud with what may be our final broadcast from CBS Radio. I'm speaking to you from our emergency station in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, though I can no longer guarantee how many of you are still able to receive this transmission. Communications across the eastern United States have collapsed over the past 18 hours. We have lost contact with our affiliate stations in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington. The last transmission we received from our Baltimore bureau consisted of nothing but screaming and gunfire before the signal went dead at 4:17 this morning. Federal emergency broadcasts ceased at noon today, and we have received no official government communications for the past 6 hours. The Emergency Command Center in Denver has not responded to any of our attempts at contact, leaving us to conclude that organized federal response to this crisis may no longer exist. From what we can observe from our current position, the biological contamination has spread far beyond the original quarantine zones. Military convoys that were supposed to establish defensive perimeters have either been overrun or have simply disappeared. The walking dead now roam freely through areas that were declared secure less than 48 hours ago. We have reports that entire cities have been abandoned to the infected. Refugee streams from urban areas have become new vectors for contamination, spreading the plague to rural communities that had believed themselves safe from the German weapon. We now go, if our correspondent is still. Fred, are you there?
I'm here, Frank, but barely. I'm reporting from what used to be Allentown, Pennsylvania, where the evacuation convoy I was traveling with was attacked this morning by hundreds of infected individuals. The military escort, the soldiers did their best, Frank, but there were just too many of them, wave after wave of those things coming out of the woods and abandoned buildings like they could smell the living from miles away. Most of them used to be civilians, men and women and children who'd been infected during the evacuation. I watched families that had survived the initial outbreaks get torn apart by their own neighbors, people they'd known their whole lives who were now just hungry, mindless things driven to bite and feed. The children, God help me, the children were the worst. They moved faster than the adults, and they got through the defensive lines before anyone could stop them. The convoy commander, Captain Hayes, he kept shouting orders even after he'd been bitten, kept trying to organize a defensive perimeter right up until he wasn't human anymore. I saw him turn, Frank. Watched a decorated officer become one of those things in less than an hour. There are no safe zones anymore, no government rescue, no military coming to save us. It's every person for themselves now, and most people don't make it very long once those things catch their scent.
Frank, I can hear them outside the building where I'm hiding. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They're trying to get in, and I don't think this door is going to hold much longer. If this is my last report, tell anyone who's still listening. Aim for the head. That's the only way to stop them. The head, Frank. Remember the head.
Frank, are you still there? Fred, we've lost contact with our field correspondent. I don't expect we'll be hearing from him again. Ladies and gentlemen, if anyone is still receiving this broadcast, I need you to understand that the United States of America, as we have known it, may no longer exist. The German biological weapon has achieved what their armies could not, the complete destruction of American civilization. We now turn to, I'm being told that we may need to evacuate this facility immediately. There are reports of infected individuals moving through downtown Harrisburg, and our security perimeter may be compromised. We now turn to Sergeant Philip Marlowe, who has been serving with evacuation forces and may be our last expert witness to...
Frank, I need to make this quick. I can hear them in the building, and there's not much time left before they find us up here. I've been fighting these things for weeks now, ever since the cities fell. Started with a few dozen infected in Iowa, and now there are millions of them wandering across the country. Every person they bite becomes one of them, and there's no cure, no treatment, no hope of recovery. The military response failed because we kept thinking of them as people who needed help. But they're not people anymore, Frank. They're weapons. German weapons that look like our neighbors and our families, but exist only to spread the infection and create more of themselves. I've seen entire towns get overrun in hours, watched refugee camps turn into slaughterhouses when just one infected person made it past the screening. The government tried quarantine, tried military containment, tried everything they could think of, but you can't quarantine a weapon that turns your own people against you. They're in the building, Frank. I can hear them on the lower floors. Moving slow but determined, following the scent of living people like hunting dogs. To anyone still listening out there, don't try to save people who've been bitten. Don't try to find a cure or wait for government rescue. The government is gone. The military is gone. It's just you and your family against millions of walking dead who want nothing more than to tear you apart and add you to their numbers. Aim for the head. That's the only thing that stops them permanently. The head, always the head. And remember, anyone who gets bitten is already dead, even if they're still walking around and talking. Don't let sentiment get you killed. They found the stairs, Frank. We need to get out of here now.
This is Frank McLeod for CBS Radio, broadcasting what will almost certainly be our final transmission. The infected have reached our floor, and we have nowhere else to run. To anyone still alive out there, anyone still listening, I want you to know that America tried to fight this thing. Our soldiers, our doctors, our leaders, they all did their best against a Nazi bioweapon designed to be unstoppable. We defeated Nazi Germany on the battlefield, but they planted a biological time bomb that has detonated across our nation. The walking dead in our streets are Hitler's final act of revenge, a weapon he designed to activate only after Germany's surrender, making retaliation impossible. The door won't hold much longer. I can see them through the glass, dozens of infected individuals, including some of our own security guards who were human just hours ago. If anyone survives this, If there's anyone left to remember, don't forget how America fell, not to German bombs or German tanks, but to the most diabolical weapon ever conceived by the Third Reich. Nazi scientists created a plague they knew would destroy us, disguised it as research we would want, and let us capture it as spoils of war. They're breaking through. I can see their faces now. Gray skin, empty eyes, mouths open and hungry for living flesh. Some of them are wearing the uniforms of soldiers who died defending this country. Others look like the civilians we tried so hard to save. All of them victims of Nazi Germany's final solution for the world. This is Frank McCloud, signing off for CBS Radio and for the United States of America. To anyone still alive, still fighting against this German plague, remember us. Remember what we were before Nazi Germany unleashed the dead upon us. Remember the head. Always aim for the head.
This is an automated emergency broadcast from the United States Federal Emergency Management Authority. This message will repeat until broadcasting capabilities are terminated. All organized government response to the biological contamination crisis has ceased as of 1400 hours, Eastern Standard Time. Federal, state, and local emergency services are no longer operational in affected regions. Citizens are advised that no rescue operations will be conducted. The biological agent released by captured German scientific materials has achieved complete saturation of the continental United States. All major population centers have been abandoned to infected individuals. Military resistance has been overwhelmed. The contamination is now beyond any possibility of containment. Citizens still capable of receiving this broadcast should understand that infected individuals, commonly known as the walking dead, retain no human consciousness or reasoning ability. They are driven solely by the compulsion to bite living humans and spread the German biological weapon. They cannot be reasoned with, cured, or returned to human status. Infected individuals can only be permanently stopped by complete destruction of brain tissue. Damage to any other part of the body will not prevent their aggressive behavior. Any person who receives a bite wound from an infected individual will develop symptoms within 2 to 12 hours, progress to clinical death within 24 hours, and reanimate as an infected individual within 1 to 4 hours after apparent death. There is no medical treatment for infection. There is no cure. There is no immunity. Any bitten person will become a threat to all uninfected individuals and should be isolated immediately or destroyed before reanimation occurs. Survivors should avoid all populated areas, maintain maximum distance from any moving human figures, and remember that infected individuals may appear to be normal humans until they begin aggressive behavior. Groups of infected individuals will be drawn to areas with living humans and may gather in large numbers. The government of the United States of America has been dissolved. No federal, state, or local authority remains operational. No military rescue is possible. No medical facilities are functioning. No transportation systems are operational. No communication networks can be considered reliable. Survival is the responsibility of individual citizens. The biological weapon designed by Nazi German scientists has achieved its intended purpose: the complete destruction of American civilization and the transformation of the American people into weapons against their own nation. This is your final directive from the United States government. The dead cannot be cured, the dead cannot be saved, the dead cannot be negotiated with. Destroy the brain, protect the living, trust no one who has been bitten. To any Allied forces in uncontaminated regions, do not attempt rescue operations in the continental United States. Do not allow American refugees into your territories. Do not trust any materials or personnel from American sources. The contamination is absolute and irreversible. This automated message will continue broadcasting until power systems fail or transmission equipment is destroyed. When this message ends, no further communications will be possible from United States government sources. May God have mercy on the United States of America. and may God preserve any human soul who survives. Remember, destroy the brain. Trust no one bitten. The dead are not your loved ones anymore. They are German weapons wearing familiar faces. This message will now repeat. God bless America. God save whoever is left.